Okay, welcome to 511, week 4. This is Dr. Keisler. We're going to be discussing chapter 4, which you read, which was how to write a research proposal. So for the purposes of this course, you're not actually going to write an entire research proposal, but you are going to write the biggest part of it, which is the literature review. So we're going to spend a little time going over the pieces of an entire proposal. And then again, last week we focused on just writing a literature review, and so this gives you an idea of kind of how literature review fits into a larger proposal. So the writing of a research proposal is generally part of the process for registering for any kind of higher degree, like if you were going to get a PhD at a university. But there are other reasons why a proposal might be written, such as an academic exercise. So like for this class, you're not going to write the whole proposal, but you're going to write the literature review. Sometimes to get business funding, or as an application for funding or approval from an ethical research board, or to get ethical approval. So an example of that would be, like when I want to write an article, or I want to do a research study, which ultimately will lead to an article in a journal, I have to go through my institutional review board first. And essentially what that is I come up with my research proposal, I give it to the Cal State Fullerton Institutional Review Board. There's a committee, they meet, they see exactly what we're going to do for the research, how we're going to do it, and then they decide whether or not it meets the parameters for doing ethical research in our particular area. And then they give us either things that we need to change, or they give us the approval. We can go ahead and do the study, and then ultimately publish that study. So there may be times that you actually do need to write an entire research proposal. So it's a valuable tool to learn, and one of the other kind of advantages is that it's an opportunity for you as a writer to practice those skills in developing a reasoned argument to an audience of your peers, or to a panel like we do for the IRB, and kind of practicing making that argument that you can produce an original and worthwhile contribution to a particular area of study. So if you're going to stay in reading, or continue with reading, and eventually you want to do some research, or you came up with a program and you wanted to introduce that program to a larger audience, you would need to have some research that would back it up. So let's go ahead and we'll talk about some of the pieces of that research proposal. So they generally have a framework that they follow. So, obviously it's a written document, and it will have a summary of prior literature, which is what you're going to end up doing. It's going to identify the research topic and have research questions that go with it, and it will identify the procedure that's going to be followed to answer those research questions. So, having a plan obviously is essential, and there's a variety of styles that you can adopt when you're laying out your proposal. Some organizations have specific requirements set out in an application, or as part of their criteria of exactly the pieces that they want, and then therefore it's essential to follow those guidelines. And sometimes you need to tailor your proposal to fit into their particular guidelines. But there's kind of this overall kind of expected level of content and the types of headings that can be broadly applied to most research proposals. And so these are the pieces that we're going to cover. So it's kind of like the generic research proposal. But be aware that, if you are submitting this somewhere one day, there may be other pieces, or they may call certain sections other things depending on that particular organization or your particular field of study. So sections of the research proposal. You have an introduction, a method, you have a data analysis, and a data analysis, man, I can't get these slides, I'm sorry, data analysis section. So you would have two examples. In your book you see two examples of the table of contents for the research proposal in your book, and you'll see that the headings can vary in that, right? You can also take a look at chapter 20 if you want to see how you would use or format headings using the APA style. But the headings, they're not always the same. So if you look at table 4.1 as an example of different versions, right, the difference there is that the data analysis is in its own section, and then in the other example, they include how you're going to do the data analysis as part of the methodology. So again, that's kind of an example of there are everybody kind of agrees on the elements that need to be in there, but sometimes the actual organization or the headings of how they would like that done can vary. All right, so let's talk about that introduction section. So even though it's an introduction section, it's quite large. So if you think of the introduction as the hook, or this is kind of where you're selling your idea, right? So you set out a purpose, which would introduce the research idea and establish its importance and its significance. Generally, the introduction starts with that general introduction, defines your research topic, demonstrates its importance, and then follows up with a review of the relevant literature. When you do your literature review, that then kind of leads directly into the statement of purpose of the. One of the things to keep in mind if you are actually writing a whole proposal is to, in this section, in the purpose piece, when you're starting to introduce and think about kind of what the aim and the focus of your study is to be realistic, right? So not to be kind of overambitious and imply that there are greater or more complicated things that you're going to be able to deliver through conducting this study. So you really want to think about what you want to do, be very clear about it, think about what kind of the line of argument and analysis would be, and then what results you would expect, and that sort of guides how you set out the purpose. Because remember, particularly in our field, you're not curing cancer by doing a study in reading, right? So it's important to remember you're not going to cure all reading struggles with reading by doing this one study. So you kind of keep that in mind as you move into or as you start to write your introduction. Like, what can I really do with this study? Why is it relevant? Why is it important? And why is it interesting? So that's something to keep in mind too, because ultimately what you want to do with the study is you want to publish it, right? So you want, whether or not you find anything, sometimes a study, you don't have any findings. And those are your findings. Your findings are, this treatment didn't make a difference, or we really didn't see anything when we went out there. We were looking for, I just did a study on writing, and we were looking to see what teachers were doing to differentiate writing instruction for English language learners. And what we learned over the course of all these observations is they were doing absolutely nothing in the 5 schools that we visited. So that doesn't mean that our study isn't worth publishing. It's actually, to the contrary, it's a very important thing to publish, is that there was nothing. We expected to see more strategies. These were schools where teachers had been trained and they had, high concentrations of English learners, but really we didn't see any differentiation. We didn't see them drawing on funds of knowledge of the student. We didn't really see anything that we would want to have seen. So, so while it didn't show anything or prove anything, it's interesting nonetheless. So that's kind of, you want to keep in mind, you want your study to be interesting. You want somebody to want to read it. So when you're thinking about your introduction and thinking about how you're going to define your topic and establish that purpose for why you want to do it, think about, would somebody want to know the answers to my questions? I don't want to go to methodology. So let's talk a little bit about the literature review. So I know that we spent all last week talking about writing a literature review, but the literature review is really essential in positioning that plan research and framing your research problem. So you, of course, want to explain what has already been done in your field and what elements of what has already been done are related. So you really need to show an awareness that what knowledge others have developed and how this groundwork or how this research lays the groundwork for the work that you want to do. This way you're kind of avoiding repetition, you understand what folks have done, and then you're showing how what you want to study is going to add or contribute to the body of literature that's out there. So what's really important to keep in mind is that through the process of this literature review, and this is going to be important for your literature review, you have to show that you have knowledge of the landmark studies, right? So oh, my phone is ringing. Hold on one second. I'm sorry. All right, sorry about that, but I'm not going to start this screencast over because my phone rang. Um, anyway, so I was saying you have to, in your literature review, kind of demonstrate that you have knowledge of those. What are those seminal pieces? What are the groundbreaking or landmark studies in your field? And then if you were doing this literature review for a research proposal, you're showing that you understand or you've identified a gap in the pre-existing knowledge. So you see that there's a gap in the literature, and that's what your study is going to try to fill in. So, we know this, so we know that, but we don't know anything about this. So like when we were doing the writing study, there's a lot of literature out there about bilingual children writing, and then there's a lot of literature out there about emergent writers, but there's not a lot of literature out there in the middle that addresses what is being done for English learners learning to write English. So it's a gap in the research, and so our study was like, well, let's first kind of go out there and see what's happening, and then from there we can take pieces and we can continue to explore. Your literature review is going to be a little bit different, and we'll talk about that at the end, how yours is different. But it's important to kind of remember that you're not just going to research for your literature review. You're not just going to find articles that are related to your topic that kind of fit in nicely. You need to have, there's certain names that we're going to want to see. There's certain pieces that you're going to want to see. So, if you you'll get that through you'll see certain names keep popping up. We don't want 10 random articles that were from the reading teacher by random people. So you need to have at least one of those big pieces in there. So one of the things to keep in mind too about a literature review is that it really is a demonstration of your ability to analyze and evaluate the research that's already out there, so the literature that's already out. So it's going to really show how much you understand about your field and how you understand or interpret how your study fits in to the topic area and builds on the work of others. And so that's definitely something that we learned right in like 514 and in 536 too, is really how things they build on one another, right? If you think about when we did all the theoretical models, just as we went on in that book, the differences came because folks looked at one model that was out there and they identified a gap, and they said, well, no, because this doesn't fully explain how somebody learns language. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to, do my studies and my observations and collect all my data, and then I come up with my own model. And this model fills in the gap of the previous model, and so then somebody else then takes that model. So kind of, everybody's work builds on top of one another. So after that introduction section, you have a section called the methods section. And this is just a written description of the specific actions, the plan, the strategy that you're going to take to answer your research question. So it includes information about the research participants, who's going to be participating in your study, the design, kind of how you're going to go out and get that data, if there's an apparatus or an instrument. So again, this kind of goes with the design would explain the overall what you're doing. So let's say with my writing study, we were interviewing teachers, we were doing short observations in the classroom just to see their writing periods, and then we were going to do a series of longer observations where we stayed the whole day so we could see writing throughout the day. Then we were going to interview the teachers again, and this interview was structured on their kind of philosophy of teaching writing. And then we had to talk about the apparatus of the instruments, like how were we collecting that data. So we had an interview protocol, and then we had an observation protocol. So they want to see what that apparatus or that instrument is for collecting that data. So that's all part of your methodology. And then there's the procedure, right, which talks about like the actual steps that you're going to take and how and when this is going to happen, how frequently you're going to do these observations or surveys or whatever it is. So I'm actually going to stop you right here because we're going to run out of time on this screencast, and we'll pick up on the next one.